Some sort of funny small windows are found on a vertical cliff in the vicinity of Bucay Rent. There are tunnels behind the small windows, and although many tourists visit them every day, very few of them take few moments to ask the question, would any human of our size invest so much labor in cutting these tunnels in the solid rock just to make something that is extremely uncomfortable to use? Look at the size of the tunnels. If you want to experience for yourself how comfortable is it to move around such tunnels, place few low tables next to each other and try propelling below them for some time. And the next exercise is to do the same while dragging sacks of potatoes, big ones. To get a first-hand experience of the version of the academics, namely that these tunnels were built by people like us to store their foodstuff there. Of course, it's possible that the people who found them later on did use them for food storage, but as far as the original design having anything to do with that, I doubt this. Well, first of all, the connecting doors or holes between the chambers are so small that not all people can go through without any luggage, of course. What to speak of dragging sacks with potatoes? Is there any point to even discuss this looking at the size of the openings? Even the few bigger doors, so to say, look like that they have been widened subsequently. If somebody was carving this into the bedrock to store something, one would make big rooms. Instead of these uncomfortable tunnels, you just put few sacks and the door to the next tunnel is blocked. This is a very inefficient use of space. And again, it clearly shows that the original design was not meant especially for storing food. As you start taking your potatoes out one by one from the sacks to transport them to the next tunnel, they will all roll down to the numerous openings in the floor, which apparently facilitate the full project of food storage. Then what about hiding from the enemy? Some people have suggested that maybe that's why people used it like this. It's, of course, very uncomfortable for living, but you see, if your enemy tries to find you, their head will stick through the third floor and then you can chop off the head. Well, it's the same situation. Yes, if somebody found these tunnels, they could have used them for hiding, but as far as being originally designed for hiding, probably not, because yes, your enemy will have a great difficulty trying to crawl through these tunnels, hitting his back and head constantly, but you will be facing the very same problems, so it's useless at the end for hiding. On the top of that, if you were designing these tunnels for hiding, you wouldn't advertise yourself with all these windows clearly visible on the cliff. And by the way, the complex design of the window protections themselves show that this was probably a residence and not just temporary hiding place. First of all, look at the amount of work invested in making sure that couple of layers, sometimes reaching up to 5 or 6 layers of protections, are carefully attached to the window. Actually, the amount of work done on the details around these windows by itself suggests that these were probably even luxury dwellings. Definitely, these were premises designed for prolonged and probably permanent use. And then 6 levels of protection. That's interesting. I mean, we have usually 2. Some people would have 3 layers on their windows, but what did they have? Were they protecting themselves from some sort of animals or bad weather? And they must have had some sort of nice transparent materials, otherwise what's the point of putting just wooden frames? Then you may not have windows anyway, if it was non-transparent. So, who built all this? Who were the original inhabitants? The first one to look out of these windows? Doesn't seem to have been a people as tall as us. In the full complex, after all, there was only one room in which we could stand properly without straining ourselves, and this room was with some sort of cuttings for storage, or maybe these were bathtubs or something like that. So the original builders were probably some other types of beings. It could have been dwarves, or let's say some sort of intelligent reptilians. Look at the holes, you can slide through them very comfortably. But I'm more inclined to believe that these were dwarfs exactly after all, because if you remember the overall panorama in the beginning, we have the windows, the way we have actually preserved remains of how these tunnel dwellings were ending, while we have a lot of remains of underground cities in Turkey, in Spain, in Italy, but we almost never see how do they end. It's always ruins and ruins, while here we have something unique. We can see more or less preserved windows on a cliff the way it was designed originally. So this could mean that this is a relatively recent underground dwelling compared to those of Cappadocia, Italy, and so on. And another thing that comes to my mind now is a study done by an English scientist. He studied the underground cities of Cappadocia, and he found that various races resided there. Initially, they were built by humans of our size and subsequently remodeled by a few other types of beings, and some of them were dwarves. So again, we see that the dwarves come to the historic scene at a relatively later stage. And also from numerous other sources, we have good reasons to conclude that the various types of dwarfs were sharing this earth in the not so far away past, even a couple of generations ago. More details about this in my video about dwarfs and in the dwarfish category of the website. And exactly like in Cappadocia, in Bucharest as well, we have both underground dwellings for people of our size and underground dwellings of dwarfs. But more about the various type of cities that I saw during the expedition in the next episode. And remember that finding out more about the different races who resided on our Earth, shared the Earth with us, is not just some curious detail. Discovering more will redefine the origin of the human species as well. And when that happens, it will change the way we perceive ourselves. And that, in its turn, will change the way we live for the better. Because knowing the truth, that means genuine knowledge. And also harmony and goodness, these are always qualities that go together hand in hand. And it is ignorance or not knowing who we are, where do we come from, that is the brother that goes hand in hand with misery. The most exotic part of our expedition was the network of allegedly Etruscan rock-cut roads. Actually, we don't know if they're roads, but at least most of them do look like that. So I will continue referring to them as roads, although at places they looked so unusual that we were even having doubts. Are all of them roads? And while some of them were of a modest height of just a couple of meters, others would reach the depth of 15 or even as much as 20 meters deep. And all that is dug into the solid bedrock. Some of these streets appear to be much older than other relatively younger sections, and so it is very difficult to say how much are there actually of them, but from what we saw, it consists at least of a network of thousands kilometers of such roads. The ones we visited, they were north of Rome, on so-called Etruscan grounds. Basically that would encompass what we saw, let's say an area of 1,000 square kilometers. So when we would walk through the nature reserves or the places allotted for cutting wood or any other area that was not plowed or built on, there would be so many segments of such roads getting exposed from below the mud, or they were never covered with mud, or some of them end at sharp cliffs being destroyed by earthquakes or faults, movements of the earth. So some layers appear to be very old, while some of them much younger, but the overall density that we got the impression of would be that of the modern road network of Italy. And actually at many places the modern roads were built on such roads, so we could see the hewn walls on the sides, and just the bottom was covered with modern asphalt. At least many hundreds of kilometers are reused in such a way by the modern infrastructure of Italy, possibly much more, because how much can we see in 10 days? Of course, there is no proper inventory done as of the amount of roads by the modern so-called academia, because the full scale of these ruins, the roads and the rock dwellings next to them, are so much more than they should have been if the historic numbers of the population of supposedly the times when they were built were correct. That's why they're conveniently declared as mystery, and that, as we know, is the usual polite prelude before excluding them from any historic studies and ignoring them. Now, in modern times, sometimes we also dig tunnels or some sort of short passages to avoid obstacles on the roads we built, but this is not the situation with this network of roads. They are dug deep into the bedrock even when the terrain is perfectly flat and friendly for vehicles to travel on the normal surface of the earth without any problem at all. So digging roads, or in some cases even wide boulevards, in a solid bedrock, no matter how hard is the stone, is a lot of work. We don't even know why they did it. Were there dangerous animals on the surface of the earth? Or were they hiding from some sort of enemies that were bombing or irradiating with something from above? Or was it just too cold or too warm, so people resorted to withdrawing to underground to seek more moderate temperatures? Maybe they were covered on the top of these roads. Going underground is certainly a method that the tribal people use to deal with extreme temperatures. We still know very little about the rock-cut roads because they have been denied study and attention. Denied study in the context that they should be looked at, which means as a part of this large network of rock-cut roads stretching at least from West Asia, covering the entire southern Europe all the way to Spain. The only thing that I'm convinced of is that these roads actually are the transition between completely underground tunnels, like those that have been excavated in Turkey and also in Europe. We mentioned them in the last episode. And on-land roads the way as we know them. And all this goes hand in hand with the rock-cut ruins where the inhabitants who used and made these roads lived. Initially, for some unknown to us reason, they lived completely underground, and their streets at that time were tunnels as long as dozens of kilometers connecting the underground cities. But then, as they could live on the surface more and more, they didn't go directly to constructing on-land roads, but first passed through the stage of the deep rock-cut roads. Although probably the network of rock-cut roads is most extensive in Etruria, in this area, it is not the only place with such networks. For example, in Spain, there are the so-called canals of medullas. Over there, they are labeled as Roman aqueducts, but they look exactly the same. That also consists of hundreds of kilometers of the same rock cut, whatever you call it. In Spain, they call it Roman aqueduct. Really, the Roman soldiers must have been very, very bored of their job at the army to dig hundreds of kilometers into the solid bedrock. Moreover, it looks like a hard variety of stone, at least from the photos. And all these rock-cut structures, let's call them like this, at various lands all over continents, are not connected only by the common idea that somebody was cutting for unknown reason roads in the solid bedrock. In Spain also, at Mecca, near Bocairent, not only the canals of Medulla, many others. So certain design elements also repeat each other. For example, when they had vehicle tracks on the sides, they would often be at the very edge of the road. That's the case in Israel and then again in Spain, everywhere. So it is hard to see a way how a cart, for example, would have used them because the wheel of the presumable cart that was presumably using this would get damaged by being rubbed on the sides of the road, on the stone all the time. This is yet another example of reusing an ancient rock-cut road, this time from France.
And at Petrojordan as well. There is just really a lot of these rock-cut streets, basically. Usually people are just shown the more recent and impressive, better preserved ruins at Petra. And those are fantastic, but what about the older stuff? There are entire streets where you can see the tool marks on the sides. Rock cut with dwellings and they do not try very hard to excavate these things. It's the same situation as in Italy.
People have become so superficial that they're not impressed by anything that is not screamingly fantastic and grabbing their attention immediately. What about the ruins that are not impressive because time has destroyed them? Look, there were rooms here. It is obviously a hewn stone. And at those older level of stonework at Petra, I mean, rock cutting has been going at just a mind-blowing magnitude and extent. Sadly, anything in the area of Petra that doesn't look Roman enough is denied study, inventory, or any publicity. And that is sad because probably just from photos it seems that many thousands of people lived in this actually probably a pretty large metropolis. And then in terms of the worldwide distribution of this type of rock cut roads, lately my suspicion is strongly growing that in North America the trails supposedly made by the first European settlers could have been actually a case of reusing on older rock cut roads. Why do I feel this way? First of all, there seem to be rock cut ruins identical in style to those of Europe and Asia. You can see them at megaliths.org. And then I found this road. The repetitive marks on the side are exactly as those of the rock cut roads on the old continent, and there are something what looks like rock cut chambers on the side of this very road. So I find all that very suspicious, and I hope that somebody in the near future will find time to examine this full area in detail. So we are always trained to associate these trails with the first settlers traveling in their wagons. But few things look suspicious. For example, this is part of the famous Oregon Trail. Just look at the cuttings on the side. I mean, the very idea of cutting a road into the solid bedrock is already a bit fishy, but it doesn't look cut for this purpose. At least that particular spot, judging from the photo, but I haven't been there in person. But still, I have read in forums testimonials of people who have actually been there, and they're wondering why at places the roots are actually knee deep. This is very uncomfortable for the animals that would supposedly drag a cart on it. You know, people say, oh, lots of carts were passing by, that's why they made such a deep trail. So what, they could get themselves together to dig such deep roads? I don't know what was the need of digging them so deep into the bedrock, and they cannot get themselves together to put something in the ruts when they become too deep so that their carts don't turn over? And then I noticed the same problem like with the European and Asian tracks, that the roots, supposed roots, alleged roots, are at the very edge of the road. That would be some sort of nightmare if you try to go with a car through such a road, because the axis, you see there are small protrusions in the middle of the wheels, they will get you stuck. Turning also would be extremely problematic on such a narrow road. Instead of calling the things with their real names, the mainstream historians have substituted the name of the ancient vehicle tracks with simply cart roads. Generally, people have bought into this idea because of their expensive suits and the titles, the shiny titles that they have. Some tracks indeed appear to be cart roads in the sense that many cars could have passed here multiple times. and have pressed them into the stone. This could be true, for example, for this Roman road. But in terms of the numerous trackways that are associated with the rock-cut ruins, they appear to be of a different nature. Like, for example, these ones from Turkey are clearly pressed into the soft mud. And then that made me assume that at all locations where we have just fields of tracks all over, they must have been pressed into the soft mud. But then this image from Sardinia again made me wonder, if it was really so soft, then how come the dwellings below didn't give in and just the vehicles fell inside them? Maybe in this case the dwellings below were built at a later stage after the mud petrified. Because as we saw in the previous episodes, rock-cut ruins were being cut for a very long period of time. And then to make it even more confusing, this multitude of tracks in Italy, they would then merge into a single one. Like this, or like this. And actually this was the usual situation in Italy, one single track running in the middle. It looked very much carved for the purpose of channeling water. And I'm sure that's the official explanation of it, but it only looks like that most of the time, not always. Sometimes it would turn into this and then go back to its simple form. Same like Spain and Turkey, by the way, where the regular marks appear and disappear for no apparent reason, just like that on the straight road. Robin in our group actually noticed that sometimes the tracks seem to split at the turns. So she suggested that it could have been something like a tube moving on one wheel, and then on the turns it would like go on one side depending where it is turning. Well, I don't know if there were trains, but if they were certainly not the way we understand trains. For example, they were capable of jumping and climbing stairs. And then at places, whatever trains or I don't know what it was, this rail in the middle, the channel was turning into what appeared to be human footsteps left in soft mud. And this situation where wide roads for the size of, let's say, a vehicle would turn into what looks to us like a pedestrian road with steps is a very common thing. I showed you a few examples in the Spain videos. Now this is in Israel. And actually, we don't know what is this channel in the middle. Maybe this on Roman road in England has some sort of similar function. And on this image from Israel, this on the left seems like maybe inside a road with something in the middle, maybe. Here, as far as we could see, the highway has become a riverbed. So this penguin trick of substituting vehicle tracks with cart routes has done enormous damage and has confused normal people who would otherwise inquire what kind of vehicles were they, things like that. Instead of doing that, they are just trying to find a way how to associate the tracks with carts or other simple vehicles. For example, in a scientific book, somebody suggested that the single tracks, because in many cases we have only a single track, even in the fields, sometimes not only on these streets. So, according to a very learned penguin, that must have been left by some sort of a simple scooter. You see, people were driving their scooters many times over and over again out there in the fields, and so it got pressed into the stone. And if you don't yet feel completely confused about these roads or rock structures, let me show you more how the tracks were also found on the walls. And not only the tracks that look as if left by tires or maybe sledges, to be more precise, were crawling on the walls. Also these ones that belonged, according to our understanding of things, to something like an excavator, they were also crawling on the walls. So in North America we saw some sort of repetitive marks on the side of the road, of course lots of in Spain and Turkey and so on, and here as far as China we see something similar. It's hard to say, but on the second photograph maybe it even looks like that it is on a rock-cut road. Absolutely possible, because we have a rock-cut underground cities in China, so possibly we had roads with the same models of vehicles. It would be nice to find out such things, but how? The Academia is really not good in presenting information about historic sites in a systematic way on a global scale. Everything should be regional and in a small box. Otherwise, it will just become obvious that people belonged to a single global civilization not so long time ago. And when they find that out, the reputation of the quackademia will of course evaporate overnight, but that will be the relatively small problem. The bigger one will be that people may stop participating in the centrally organized wars by those same who shout very loud on microphones about democracy and peacekeeping and so-called brotherhood, ironically. Now we call this a rock cut road. It's in Turkey. But since exactly in these areas the tracks were left in a soft mud, then actually we should call it mud scooped road. So were the deep roads in Italy also scooped away by some sort of machine? Now this mud scooped road is found on a field full of thousands of tracks going all around the so-called road. Then what is the need of having a road anyway? Or maybe these tracks around, were they like plowing the earth? Then it would make a bit of sense, like we have roads besides our fields and then we have a tractor tracks on the fields. But then the mud or the earth around doesn't look plowed very much. So this is how the roads, our roads as the technologically advanced, look in that very same area of Italy, even in Rome, even in the center of Rome. So how come the allegedly much more simple people of the past would construct roads that are much more difficult to construct than our modern, and then they would have the resources to maintain them in a more beautiful shape than us? And the ancient roads were not only much more difficult to construct but also to maintain. Just think of all the big stones and other stuff constantly falling from the top. And what about if the people were not really that simple then in the past? And what if we are actually the simple ones? And it is only our sick belief system that has assured us that we are great. This is actually typical for every arrogant fool to consider himself great and most definitely superior. So let me tell you about our visit to Norcia. Officially labeled as one of the biggest necropolises, complex of necropolises in entire Europe. So we arrived at the location, this was the tourist board, and then we started walking and walking and walking. There were lots of thorns and lots of nature, but we had a map. There were no necropolises actually, but there were more and more thorns. And then finally we were lucky to again meet some people who were gathering mushrooms, and it turned out that the necropolises are actually a few meters away, but we can't see them because everything is just totally overgrown. So this is the state of affairs actually with the historic rock cut ruins in Italy. The official academia has been bought and sold by the propaganda departments so many times, so they are not much interested in historic sites. The alternative researchers, they are more interested in the history of the aliens. But what about the history of our race, the human? And so were these streets indeed cut in stone by the Etruscans, as the mainstream version is? It is possible that the last layers had something to do with the Etruscans, but definitely we also saw rock-cut streets in the older layers. And it doesn't even really matter if we label them as Etruscan or not, because we know very little about the Etruscans anyway. We basically know that these were a group of people who used an alphabet belonging very similar to the type of writing that was used by the tribes that were contacted and educated by the survivors of the old civilization, people who had some remnants of the old knowledge. Otherwise, the Etruscans did not seem to have been ethnically homogeneous group of people, because we see depictions of African Etruscans, Nordic-looking Etruscans. And in the survivors documentary, we saw that we see a similar cocktail mixture of races and ethnicities almost anywhere where the survivors left their imprint upon the culture. For example, Simon, our local guide, he had a reason of his own to think that the Etruscans must have been foreigners. Just looking at the unbelievable amount of work invested in cutting all these dwellings, chambers and roads, kilometers, thousands of kilometers of rock-cut roads, that is such an amount of work that he thinks that a real Italian with Italian blood in his veins could have never caused such a self-abuse, working himself to death in such a way. Why am I making all these documentaries? Does it even matter if this very old rock cut stuff is made by Etruscans or green dwarfs? By raising the public awareness that the stories that we are told in the history classes are nothing more than wild fantasies on historic topics, they only resemble the actual historic events, but just barely, just enough to make it look realistic.
So hopefully at some point humanity as a whole, not just individuals here and there, will decide enough of these historic fantasies and say, now I really want to know, where do I come from?
And most importantly, I really want to awaken people to the fact that, okay, so if they are serving me such shameless lies as actual history, then what about all the other information that they're telling me in school and in the newspapers and on TV? If they have been lying to me like this about history, can I also trust the news that I read in the mass media every day? Are the events that take place in those alleged news really taking place, or are they also wild fantasies connected to something similar that happened?
But humanity as a whole is not yet mature enough to go to this step, because basically for the common people, all the information that they gather all around is either from the mass media or from people who believe in the mass media. And that's how the common idea of what reality is actually formed.
And ironically, most people are convinced that this reality is based on actual facts, but it is not. It is by interpretations of facts and things that people have never seen, and they just believe it is there. And it is exactly this fear of stepping in the area of non reality that people consider as no man's land. That's what prevents most people from exploring the other options of realities that they can live in. Most people will agree, yes, my government lies to me, it censors the news, but still those very same people will continue sticking to the general conclusions that they draw about the existence from the sum total of this news. And indeed, people have gone so much out of touch from the shamanic practices of their own forefathers that they will even think, are you telling me to explore other realities? That's craziness, that's insanity actually. And so man ignores the gentle whisper of the old prophecies. But still, eventually, he'll find his way to the land of peace of beauty where those prophecies are calling him, just on a different route. He will discover them by his own, and he will only find time to sit and think when one day he finds himself hungry and homeless. Because the wars of those faraway lands that were lingering for decades finally reached his threshold. And only then, when man thinks that he has lost everything that he has imagined had value, only then he will find strength within and will be brave enough to start facing what he has been considering dangerous subconscious realms. And brave enough to be honest with himself. And then things like this will start crossing his mind. You know what? Years ago, I voted for those politicians. I knew they were crooks and criminals. I knew that with the heavy taxes they forcibly take from me, they finance wars. And I knew that millions of people suffer horrific pain. But I didn't have any choice at that time, because I thought that's how life is. But maybe there are also other realities. Maybe it is even possible to live without being forced to harm others by so-called external situations, or the nature around that we manage to ruin successfully as well, completely.
And only then will it cross his mind. He will think to himself, you know, there were some people going to these old rock-cut ruins here nearby, and they were making some sort of ceremonies honoring the spirits of the ancestors. What kind of ancestors? Well, now that I've got nothing to lose, why not give it a try?
And that's how people will rediscover and start appreciating actually the rock-cut ruins. And they will start interacting with the ancient spirits associated with them.
And eventually they will figure out the main message left by the old legends, that nature all around is not dead, but each and every plant, and even each and every atom, every molecule, has a consciousness much like our own, and that humanity is meant to interact with that consciousness.
And that all events, like for example calamities that we say they come upon us, they seem to be beyond our control. They are nothing else but manifestations, gross manifestations of the subtle things, like the thoughts and belief systems of the beings that reside in this particular environment. And so gradually man will start learning how to modify the reality around the surroundings using subtle means and not the direct mechanical approach we are used to nowadays. In May 2016, I took part in an expedition of Alexander Kaltepin to Spain, and a lot of what I saw certainly places large question marks next to entire chapters of what commonly people call well-known ancient history. But out of all sides, it was certainly the ancient roads and the vehicle tracks on some of them that posed the most interesting questions. Let's start with Bocairent, which was, by the way, the very first site we visited on the first expedition day. So in the vicinity of Bucairent, there was this old road, which at places looked the way we are told an old road should look like. In schools, simply primitive people putting stones next to each other to pave the road. But then it turned out that this was built on the basis of yet another, much older, heavily eroded road, or let's say partially built on it, because the erosion ate it up completely at most places actually. But the few preserved segments were quite interesting. My first thought when we arrived was, why on earth would anybody cut out in the solid bedrock entire road to start with and then in the middle of nowhere? It doesn't look particularly romantic out there, just the barren hills after all. And eventually it turned out that this is not the middle of nowhere, and this is not a road, at least the way most of us imagine a road. And third, probably nobody was cutting the solid rock as such, maybe. First of all, what I mean by it was not a normal road exactly, well, at least the old one has steps on it. I don't know if the relatively recent repairs, those of medieval or so-called Roman looks, also had steps, because those are also mostly washed away and destroyed, those parts, but the original older parts certainly had well-visible steps at number of places, not just one. So either it was a wide pedestrian lane, or it was for vehicles that would seem somewhat strange to us. At regular intervals, numerous cuttings or marks could be seen on the road. They would be some 2-3 meters apart. A lot can be speculated if these are traces of the vehicles that passed here, or some sort of wooden structure was attached, so the road or the pedestrian lane was more luxury. But in any case, these marks show that something was going on here, and this was just not yet another very primitive, simple road out there in the fields. At good number of places on this road there were marks that would be difficult to explain using our idea of what road is. They were neither steps, because often they were found on perfectly flat surface, neither they could be very convenient for the types of vehicles we use with wheels below. We saw similar marks besides vehicle track at another site in Spain again called Mecca. This site was somewhat better preserved. And then something very similar is again found next to vehicle tracks, this time in Belintash, a very large and very heavily eroded so-called elf castle place. But let's return to our heavily eroded old road at Bucairent. Immediately as we arrived, Alexander Kaltipin, as a professional geologist, immediately noticed and said this landscape is not fully natural. There was some sort of terraces or something else. Looking around, this is exactly what I saw, and at that time I thought this is a bit far-fetched. But after walking around in the area for a couple of hours, I noticed too many marks and traces of intelligent activity scattered all over those barren uninteresting looking at first sight rocks. For example, this is the road itself with its quadratic marks, and these are steps on the side, leading where? Leading to what is now barren fields, if not just even more boring rocks. At few spots along the road, even parts of chambers were still preserved. But of course, for the official academics, it's much easier to turn them into trash sites, garbage depositories, instead of actually bothering to study them and the full area around, which was full of small clues of intelligent activity. This went on for a couple of kilometers, so at least there was a town, if not a city. What could turn a town or a city into smoothened stone slopes is a challenging question, and that is why they went for the easier solution, turning it into a garbage depository. On a vertical cliff in the distance, rectangular openings could be seen. Probably they lead to inside chambers. At few spots, steps were clearly visible for a couple of meters, but then they would fade away, deleted by erosion. This is how the two marks on the side of the road looked like. I'm not a specialist, I don't know what could have left such long scratches. But at one particular location alongside the road, where a rectangular cutting was partially preserved, it really looked like as if some bulldozer worked here. One thing is for sure, no modern bulldozer could have reached due to lack of road suitable for it. But also it is possible that these marks were left while this was still soil and later on it got petrified. More about this in the next episode. There was a short segment of vehicle tracks as well, proper ones, but not on the road. They were out there in the stone field and unfortunately were badly preserved. But even though a very small segment was preserved in between the two tracks, clearly the quadratic shaped marks could be seen between the two tracks, same size like those of the pedestrian road, of which few kilometers were somewhat preserved. The next site was called Los Molinos. Although very little fraction segment of the tracks was preserved, for a few meters they were so crisp that it is really obvious that they were left in the mud. And that is for those who still doubt that there is a possibility that most of these tracks were left by many vehicles who were always following the same track on a stone road. And that is very important because it proves that the vehicles were roaming on the face of the earth when these rocks were liquid, or at least soft. According to mainstream geology, that would have been many thousands of years ago, when we were monkeys for all practical purposes. So if the geological dating of these layers is correct, then it proves the stupidity, the ridiculousness of the mainstream history. And if the mainstream geological dating is wrong, then this means again that the dating of the extreme antiquity in the popular history is wrong again because it is entirely based on that wrong geological dating. An interesting detail can be observed on the Los Molinos tracks. These vehicles, sledges, or I don't know, cars with tires, whatever they were not afraid, they didn't mind to scrape the mud on both sides. Here it scraped it vertically on the right side, some 50-60 centimeters high. This is the place. Sorry, it didn't come out very good on the photographs. And after a few meters, it did the same on the left side. But in terms of vehicles tracks to study during this expedition, by far the most interesting site was the one called the Castle of Mecca. The complex of ruins of buildings and countless vehicle tracks forming a mesh all over with the countless crossings, all this went on for kilometers. Out of all that, there was only one better preserved track, some 1 kilometer long. This is a panoramic view of this track from far away, and maybe because it was dug into the ground some 2-3 meters, maybe that's why it got sheltered from the elements and did not erode so badly as everything else. This is a side view of the trench of the track. Because of the safety created by this trench, there were some crisp spots. See how sharp are the imprints? This is one of the best proofs that these imprints were left in the soft mud and were not a result of many vehicles repeatedly passing over the same place on a stone road. And because it was a soft ground, as more vehicles passed, they left their own tracks. As you can see, these are casually left tracks of a vehicle just there in the mud. They are not a result of regular traversing of the same path again and again. So there was this very sharp and sudden U-turn on this preserved segment, 2 or 3 meters dug into the ground. The vehicles we know of, modern cars or animal carts, they wouldn't go through this without getting stuck or damaged or at least badly scratched. But apparently those vehicles were different because their whatever tires or sledges on the sides were at the very end next to the wall. So really not sure, were they very short or very flexible or simply designed to function in difficult terrain or maybe even dig as they go? The quadratic signs that we discussed at Bocairent were definitely here as well, but not all the way through the track. One would get the impression as if the vehicle or whatever engineering equipment was on these tracks, it was sometimes retracting and sometimes using this whatever was making these imprints. They would be visible for a couple of dozen of meters and then they would suddenly disappear. But when they were present, they were always at this regular distance, not chaotic. And officially I have heard that these are animal tracks. Must have been some bird with hooves, quadratic hooves, the size of the leg of an elephant that landed and walked exactly in a funny fashion between the tracks for 30 meters and then flew away. It could have been also a flying crocodile. Penguins, polar bears, or anything else from the animal kingdom would be suitable as well for inclusion in the official history textbooks, or anything else as long as it does not have a hint of engineering in it. Besides the quadratic marks in the middle, there were also some sort of holes on the side, also at a regular space, and other as if marks, as if a strange bulldozer passed by. These particular ones went on for some time. They were also very regularly spaced and on both sides of the road. Abundance of cuttings and even what looked like ruins of buildings were precariously near to the tracks, literally a couple centimeters away from where would the tires be. That is, if there were any tires or wheels at all. In a few minutes I'll show you why sometimes I doubt that these vehicles were either very light or were not putting all of their weight on the ground. Exactly as at Bocairent, every few meters there were cuttings that were going all across the road and even on both sides. They were like this. But this wasn't everywhere. We could observe it only on one particular segment for a couple of dozen meters. But it is entirely possible that such cuttings were present everywhere, just we could not see them due to the erosion. Variety of models of vehicles were roaming on the earth at that time. The width of their what would be tires probably ranged from 10 to 19 centimeters. There were plenty of things that is very difficult to make sense of. For example, channels, cuttings, or I don't know what in the rock, looking exactly like tracks, connected the highways with the numerous rectangular cuttings that were all over the place. This is a close-up of one such connection. Some people quickly conclude that they must have been draining the water from the road, or even collecting water in the rectangular cuttings because they resemble water reservoirs. I'm not at all convinced personally that any of this could be the case, because just look at it. If you wanted to drain the water out, the cutting should have been much deeper. But all of the cuttings were very shallow, so draining out the road, I personally think it's out of question. And I don't think these were water slide vehicles, because mostly their tracks are found just in the open field, not necessarily in a trench like here. And as far as filling up the rectangular reservoirs with water, first of all, they don't hold any water. I sincerely doubt they ever did. They are most likely actually staircases. We're gonna see it in the next episode. But the strongest argument against the hypothesis that any of these side cuttings has something to do with channeling water is the fact that, first of all, they're very shallow. At the places they just become flat and blend with the surface. Anyway, that could be an erosion as well. But the main thing is that they go up and down the surface. Water will not want to follow them when they do that. And now I want to show you detail that impressed me really in particular. Unfortunately, the footage is very poor, but this line of small stones, actually that's a track. Just one of the countless tracks that are literally all over the place. So there is nothing strange that there is a track there. The strange thing is that it ends at the main road. That on the left is the main road, and it really ends very abruptly. In other words, same situation like here, but at much bigger height, at least half a meter, if not much more. The track ends just nowhere. So if the upper track was to be made later, it means the vehicle was very light and maybe even flew away when it met the main road, or it landed on it without leaving any marks on the side of the road. So either it was very light or it was partially propelled in the air. Or if the track was already there and the main road was made afterwards, then it seems that these vehicles were maybe even digging as they go. Number of places we see the vehicle tracks in trenches and nowhere a single human step. So there is a good chance that some of these vehicles, at least some, could dig as they go. Another interesting detail was that the somewhat better preserved road had a high step on it at one point. So were the vehicles jumping over it, or how did it work? I'm not sure. Also, this seems to be a subsequent addition to the road at the time when the megaliths were added to this site, because I really don't think the megaliths belong to the original, the oldest site, simply because they're not so eroded as the rest. So this is how this step looks like, but even if it is a subsequent addition by the medieval folks, for example, to drive their ox carts here, and then again doesn't look like a very convenient jump for anybody or anything on the road. Medieval style primitive stonework could be seen here and there, and this is normal for all very ancient sites. Almost all of them have been reused through the ages, probably by many cultures each. Such primitive patches obviously don't match the original style, and most importantly, if they were part of the original structure, they would have been washed away 1,000 times by the forces which leveled down the metropolis almost completely. And not only leveled it with the ground, sometimes even the ground is missing. Now what you see on the far right is the beginning of a very, very high vertical cliff. And just a couple of meters before that, we see the ruins, the right angles of probably some sort of remain of a building. Or other architectural elements, also tracks were finishing at such vertical cliffs. So obviously entire parts of the metropolis got just swallowed up by time completely. Entire parts of the mountain going missing. And then this photo was taken as I stood on the main road, so to say. Parallel to it were, well, highways with many other tracks. So serious driving was going on in those days. And then on this photograph, you see how the road looks like after the preserved segment is over. You can't recognize it as a road, and boulders have rolled down on it. So don't think that we have a relatively fresh historic site in general just because I showed you few tiny, well-preserved segments. In general, everything is very, very eroded.
Arslan nurgun çeçe
Here at the Mecca Castle there was also a segment of road very similar to that at Bocairent. Here you can see it was a very short segment, just 10 or 15 meters. It looks like a cut road. Both sides it's cliffs. That's what has remained from it now, but then it turns into a stairway. So it was a pedestrian road again, or a road for vehicles, which don't mind staircase. Here is Alexander Kaltepin explaining that for the water to make such erosion marks on this staircase, it should have worked for many thousands of years at least. The vehicle tracks of Spain are same as those ancient vehicle tracks in the Phrygian Valley of Turkey. All of the characteristics of the tracks at both locations match perfectly, and they are left in geological layers that date at the same time. And they are never found in geological layers that date to other periods, so most probably they belong to the same civilization. Identical tracks again in the layers belonging to this period are found in few other countries, but very little is known about them, maybe because they are not so well preserved or simply because they are not studied. The local Turkish historians and geologists who study the remains of the relatively more famous network of underground cities of Goreme, Cappadocia, Direnkuyu, and so on, they say that they have found some clues that show a connection between these vehicle tracks and the network of underground cities. It didn't say what are the clues exactly, but this could be true because this network of underground cities is also very widespread in Spain, which is gonna come in the next episodes, and it will make sense a bit at least. Why don't we see any human tracks anywhere besides the vehicle tracks, neither in Turkey nor in Spain? Well, apparently the people were underground. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe in those times outside it was safe only for vehicles, not for people.